I was just going to touch on what you said about candidates. So two things that came to mind, which is one, at least in my experience, senior engineer doesn't necessarily mean senior engineer, because generally speaking, I feel like we, at least in the development community, you give people the term senior based on they've been doing this for X amount of time. That doesn't mean necessarily that they are senior as in like they have the answers, which I think a lot of people forget. They just think, oh, you've been doing this for 10 years, so you must be great. But it's like, well, I could have been doing this for 10 years at a junior level and now I'm a senior. So
exactly.
That. But I was also going to say, I was also going to say for people that listen, it's not, at least for me, and Catalin, you can tell me if you don't agree, it's not that you need to know everything super in depth. Like for my example, right? So it's like if somebody asked me like, how do you use Dagger or why do you use Dagger? I could give them an answer, you know, about dependency injection and kind of like why it's a good idea and all that kind of stuff. And if somebody asked me to go a bit more in detail and they're like, you know, all right, behind the hood, how does Dagger work? Mate, I have no idea. Right. And there's going to be candidates that you get that will know the answer for that. But my thing is more, do you understand why you're doing what you're doing? So like to the MVVM example, I've had so many people, we go on projects, you know, a few new candidates come in and they're like, oh, we want to change the architecture of this app to MVVM. Why? Because that's how Google says to do it. That's not a reason. That's because you like a lot of the times as well. I think people think that the new thing is an improvement over the old thing and it will give you benefits. Like it will make you act faster, but that's not the case. Like it's a different way of doing things. And like I've been doing projects, all the projects I've done for probably the past 5 years have been MVVM. And then the last project where we had to refactor the whole thing and we knew that we were going to be getting a bunch of junior devs on board to this project, we decided to go with MVP for the architecture, right? There's nothing wrong with using MVP if you know how to do it properly and make it lifecycle aware and all that kind of stuff. There's nothing wrong with doing that. That's not the wrong answer. So I think like if people don't understand why they're doing what they're doing, that's definitely the missing part. Like you can't go to an interview and be like, I do this because Google told me to do it. You know, that just does not fly.
Totally. So I think that if there's one thing, if somebody's, you know, listening, you know, not really in regards to an interview and how you'll perform to it, but in your career, I think it's essential when you're using something, be sure that you understand why you're using it and what benefits it brings. Because when you get into a table to some developers and you're discussing about the technology, and I mean, we have a good example, Jetpack Compose navigation, which in my opinion is not the best library. We can expand on that in the following example. But when you get into a discussion with a developer, right, and you're discussing about technologies and stuff, and, you know, just as a fun example, you talk about a tool, Compose navigation, and you'll say, "Oh man, this is awesome. This Compose navigation library is the new stuff. This is the good stuff." And you know, the other candidate can try to elaborate on candidate. I'm sorry, your friend you're talking to.
Sure.
You try. Maybe that friend is going to go into details about why it's good and why it's bad, and from that point on, you know, you're left out of the conversation. And this is just like the you know, maybe not the best example, but I think it's essential from this discussion that we had that you need to understand why you're using something. I mean, maybe you just learned it and it's fine to not understand everything from, you know, day one. But at some point you need to revisit and understand why you're using it. I think it's essential to, because otherwise you're using tools just for the sake of it. You're not using tools to help you in your project. The same thing with architecture. You need to adapt it to your needs. You could use MVP today in a correct manner and be it as efficient as the MVVM. For example, you know, I've seen implementations of MVP which were totally fine, and then the change which was in MVVM was again subjective, because lots of people were saying MVVM brings the advantage of decoupling the view model, you know, from the view, not being tied through an interface, and also having reactive pieces of UI that can be observed. Now, obviously, at its core, nobody says that MVP can't have those, right? At the end of the day, if you ask me, MVVM is just MVP, maybe with reactive UI state, maybe with that. But again, people could have used that. I mean, we've had MVP and we used a state object inside the reactive stakeholders. So, I mean, that doesn't mean that, obviously, maybe that implementation FMP where the view would kind of interact with an interface, but most important, the view model would kind of mutate the UI through an interface, then maybe I can agree that that's not ideal.
Sure.
Because, it kind of ignores this kind of huge benefit of reactive or observable pattern that we have with RX Java, live data, whatever you want to mention it. So, again, it's really important to understand why you're using it. And you're not going to migrate to MVVM, as you mentioned, just because MVVM is the new thing. The same with other stuff. So, you need to understand which are the benefits and which are the trade-offs. And just to sum this up, I mentioned compose navigation, which, to be honest, on my Udemy course, I had to go into other topics. Like navigation and other libraries, curtains and stuff, simply because, people were just asking them, asking to learn about them, even though, again, the scope of the course was compose. But it was interesting to see how these things blend, even though, maybe retrofit has nothing to do with the UI layer. Again, on one side, I had students complaining about me teaching them and other students complaining about not teaching them. So another takeaway, if you're going into this direction, just as a small tip, don't really take to your heart things like that. Just some things you're not going to be able to please everyone. So something that probably a lot of people are saying, but I'm just going to reiterate it. Going back to my example with compose navigation, if there is one library within my Udemy course that students complain about, I not really complain, but I find a lot of weird issues, is compose navigation. And I think a lot of developers that have been using it are echoing this sentiment. Unfortunately, defining your Android app routes as URIs, like a web app, is just not going to make sense for me. I mean, I try to teach it. People are using it. Even at work, we're using it, but, it's not ideal. So for small apps, maybe it's fine, but I've had so many issues, just trying to navigate to a simple scenario, navigating to a detail screen. And if you pass, you have slash and then the ID of that, because that's you have, for example, list of restaurants, and then you have the main route, the start path, restaurants. And then you want to go to restaurant details, and then you have restaurants dash, and then you need some sort of identifier for that restaurant to get its details, right? And if at runtime the backend will return something funny for that ID, your app might even crash. And I have a good example for that. At some point, just out of human error, there was a navigation to a detail screen, and the ID was received from the server to be an HTTP link.
Okay.
Again, human error, but the app crashed because the library tried to take that as a deep link, even though there was no deep link defined. So a lot of stuff like that. I think Gabor Varadi went into much more detail than I can do that right now, with a lot of things that are not working. And that's why we have replacement libraries like Rafael Costa's library with composed destinations. Why do you think that library came up? It came up because developers were not happy with a lot of things. And one thing that comes into my mind right now, I just remembered, is that you can't pass parcelable objects. I don't know, maybe in the last updates, maybe they added that, but, when I initially played around with it, I couldn't. Because everything is defined as a path. So how are you going to send an item, which again, for some cases makes sense. For some cases, it can make sense. So stuff like that. I think it's really important to be able to kind of at least understand that there are trade-offs to everything. Every library.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And that also proves the point that, because, Google or Apple, whoever it is, told me to do it is not the right answer, because a lot of the time it's not even ready. Like a lot of stuff that gets promoted now as, this is the next best thing, is not ready for production. Like you can't do that. Like people are creating libraries to fix bugs in new libraries. Like that's when you know that that's not always the right answer.